Book TV continues now with a discussion on the book The Wikileaks Files, a collection of the most important 2.3 million State Department cables released by Wikileaks in 2010. Author and journalist Jeremy Scahill is joined in discussion by Julian Assange via video link from the Ecuadorian Embassy in London.
Invite all of you here. This is the launch of the Wikileaks Files. I'm Jacob Stevens. I'm the director of Verso Books, and we've been working on this project with Julian Assange and with Wikileaks for about 4 years now. And so this is the culmination of a lot of collaborative editorial and political work that we're very proud of, and we're thrilled to be able to publish this in close cooperation with Julian Assange and with Wikileaks, and with his fantastic introduction. You should all get a copy. If you haven't got one on your way in, then get one on your way out. It's part of the ticket. And it has in it an amazing roundtable discussion and analysis of what we can really learn from this huge leak of diplomatic cables, and what we can learn about the operation of US empire and US foreign policy from this. And I'm extremely proud to introduce Jeremy Scahill, who is going to lead this conversation with Julian Assange. Jeremy Scahill, I'm sure you all know, one of the great journalists of our time, the author of Blackwater and Dirty Wars, and of course the film Dirty Wars. Jeremy Scahill, please come up. Also, I should add, one of the founders of Intercept. Intercept, of course, carrying on the great work of WikiLeaks and of Edward Snowden. And you can carry on with that. Thank you.
Well, it's really great to be here. I live in this neighborhood, and I never imagined I would actually be on this stage. I'm used to listening to people who are good singers come up here. They asked me if I wanted a music stand. I thought there was a miscommunication. They thought I was going to sing. It's like the last thing any of you guys would want to hear. You know, I'm really honored to be here to help launch this incredibly important book because we are gathered here at a time when there is a war in this country, not only against journalists, but against journalism. There is a war against people of conscience within the United States government who dare to speak out without permission, who dare to uncover extrajudicial killings, extra-legal activities by the government, unconstitutional activities that are done in our names and with U.S. taxpayer dollars. There has been a criminalization of independent journalism in this country that has manifested not only in the form of surveilling journalists, but in prosecuting whistleblowers. And as we know, this administration, the Obama administration, which is headed by a constitutional lawyer by training, has indicted more people under the Espionage Act than all of his predecessors combined. The message that this administration has sent by going after journalists' phone records, by presiding over trials of Chelsea Manning, who is now serving decades in prison and continuing to be harassed and abused while in government military custody, presided over the ruining of the lives of people like Thomas Drake, one of the original NSA whistleblowers, by throwing people like John Kiriakou in prison, who had the audacity to speak out about torture, while at the same time allowing the people that created the torture program, Dick Cheney, Jose Rodriguez, Donald Rumsfeld, to be on book tour, to be accepted as legitimate members of society with something to say on the elite talk shows on Sunday. You can tell a lot about where our morals reside in this country by looking at what war criminals are on book tour and what whistleblowers are in prison. We can see a lot about who we are as a society. Now, our special guest tonight is not able to be here with us in person because of a campaign similar to those that I've described against these whistleblowers. Julian Assange, and I know that there is a lot written about him in the press, There is a lot said about him in the press. His personal life is debated every day in some publication across the world. Julian Assange spearheaded a project that made it possible for a brave whistleblower on multiple occasions, whistleblowers on multiple occasions, to provide concrete primary source material on secretive government programs, on extrajudicial murders of journalists and civilians, and provide the people of this country and the world with an incredible map into a secret bureaucracy that in a democracy all of us should have a chance to understand and debate. When I was reading Julian's introduction to this book, I was struck that it feels like a piece of writing from a different era. It feels like a philosophical writing from the late 50s or early 60s because it takes account of history. It's not written for the Twitterati. It's not written for the short attention span society. It delves into the history and refers to the history of the Ming Dynasty, of using papyrus as paper, of having messengers cross mountains in an effort to map out the geography of empire. And what he says in his essay, and I encourage all of you to read it, is that by looking at just individual cables and what they say about a particular country or a particular operation that the US was involved in, we are casting aside the empire and just looking at the cables, the forest and the trees analogy. And it's noting all of this that unfortunately we have to welcome Julian Assange by video link instead of him sitting here on this stage. But please join me in welcoming WikiLeaks founder and publisher Julian Assange.
Thanks, Jeremy, for those kind words. Good to see you again.
The last time I saw you, Julian, we were sharing a whiskey in the confinement of the Ecuadorian embassy there in London.
I remember about a year and a half ago, maybe, or is it 2?
Yeah, it could be. I wanted to start off. There's a lot to talk about here. I want to not forget that we are talking at a moment when Chelsea Manning, of course, is still in the crosshairs of the government. Edward Snowden is, of course, in exile, and other whistleblowers that have not yet been taken by the government across the spectrum are quite possibly out and in our midst and facing persecution in the future. But I did want to ask you about the latest on your current situation. There's been speculation over the past months that you were potentially going to leave the embassy, that statute of limitations have run out in some of the cases against you in Sweden. But I wanted to give you a chance in your own words to address people here. And I'll have you know we have a packed crowd here in Brooklyn, New York. Just let us know what's going on with you, what's the latest on your case, what are your thoughts about what's going to happen in the coming months with you?
Okay, it's going to be fantastically boring and a bit technical. I'm of course sick to death of the whole issue, as you can imagine. But okay, I've been detained now for 5 years without charge in prison, under house arrest, and then in this embassy. Now, that's without any publicly revealed charge. There's a possibility, my Washington lawyers say almost a certainty, that there's a sealed indictment in the United States, but otherwise there's no charges. We have about a dozen different legal cases around the world, about half a dozen criminal cases. So those are United States, Sweden, criminal cases that we have taken, offensive criminal cases, in Iceland, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Germany, additional criminal cases against me in Australia and Saudi Arabia. So we have a lot going on. That doesn't include the civil cases that we have going in relation to unlawful banking blockade that has been constructed against us by Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Bank of America, Western Union, Diners Club, Discover, JCB, and Swiss Post Finance. We've defeated most of that banking blockade. Okay, coming up to the present moment, the status now in the United States is there is a pending prosecution for espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage Computer Fraud and Abuse, which the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act contains a mini Espionage Act conversion, which is stealing government property, and general conspiracy. And that's a charge spectrum. We don't know how many charges of each type, we just know the types. That information came out because the US government has been sending warrants to a variety of service providers in the United States, including Google. It's managed to get a number of gag orders on Google, but some of those have been overturned, and so as a result, we have the warrants for about 6 of our journalists that the United States has served that on. Now, very interestingly, there was a case in US federal court in DC earlier this year, in March. And a judgment in that case related to us. And we, together with EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center in Washington, DC, were trying to understand whether the US government had been illegally surveilling our supporters in the United States. And freedom of information requests were filed in relation to that. And the DOJ and FBI has been battling this out for about 2 years. And the judgment found that the WikiLeaks case, the case against me, is effectively a state secret in the United States. That is, the US government argues to even reveal a single line, a single word out of the 100,000 something pages that the DOJ and FBI has in their pending prosecution would be to harm that pending prosecution and to harm US national security. So as a result, that series of Freedom of Information Act requests is restricted, but further, around another 500 Freedom of Information Act requests filed by us, by our lawyers, by other journalists in the United States and other civil rights groups are also held back. So there's it's like a Hoover Dam blocking off a torrent of documents, all under the excuse that there is a pending prosecution of me. And so it leads to an interesting, we might have shot ourselves in the foot a bit politically, insofar as if the case is dropped in the US, then suddenly this dam breaks open and something like 100,000 documents into the US persecution of WikiLeaks come out. So politically, they have to keep the case going.
And you know, what would, just game out this scenario for a second. What is your logic for not just exiting the embassy and saying, I'm going to challenge all of this, both from the United States end of things and the Swedish end of things? And I realize those two things have different legal repercussions for you in answering this, but you know, you certainly have never been shy about challenging the empire, challenging the US government. You had prominent US politicians saying you should be assassinated in a drone strike. You were portrayed as a threat to US national security by very powerful current officials. What is stopping you from stepping outside of the embassy and saying, I am going to face all of this head on, and if you want to put me on trial in the United States, you're going to have the trial of the century because I'm going to have the best lawyers and you're wrong. And I'm right, and I have justice on my side. What's to stop you from doing that, Julian?
Well, I've thought about it. Presently, the UK, Sweden refuses to guarantee not to extradite me to the United States. The UK also refuses to say whether they have already received US extradition order or not, and we know that Sweden was already in informal talks about extraditing to the United States, which was published in the London Independent. We have thought about it. It is perhaps something to do at the right political time if we can be convinced that there would be a fair process in the United States. But just like Edward Snowden, there cannot be a fair process in the United States. Let me explain why. The US government has been admits to have run a grand jury against us now for 5 years in Alexandria, Virginia. Alexandria, Virginia is the hotbed of the national security state. It is in the catchment area for the jury pool of CIA, Pentagon, the Department of Homeland Security, and so on. It is the largest single concentration. of US government workers. And it's not by coincidence. In fact, the US government tries to make sure that all cases involving national security claims are held in Alexandria, Virginia, which has what they call there the rocket docket, and pushes cases through very fast. And you've got a jury pool where you have significant problems in finding enough jury members on your side. There's also a special rule that says that you can't get rid of a jury member because of what their spouse does.
One of the things that amazes me about your reality is that whenever people start to write off WikiLeaks as irrelevant, you somehow seem to get your hands on more documents. For instance, the bounty you put recently on the TPP, and the fact that you guys were able to affect that debate while the founder of the organization is stuck in a handful of small rooms inside of an embassy in London, without divulging any methods or sources. How do you see the ongoing relevancy or relevance of WikiLeaks in the current era? What is it that you hope to achieve, even though you are stuck talking to us on a video screen and limited in your movements? What is it that you hope to achieve, and how is it that you're able to still get documents?
There's a frown on my face because, Jeremy, you sound like you're being digitized and placed underwater on Mars, if that is at all possible.
Dick Cheney is in the room, that's why.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, we hear you perfect.
Okay, so why they try and fix your audio? I didn't understand the gist of that question. So I'll just speak
the short
a
of
little
it,
bit why they fix it.
Can you hear me, Julian?
It's super bad. Okay. So I just want to say I can make a dedication while waiting for that to be fixed. I'd like to dedicate this book, here it is, and its US launch to Michael Ratner, the President Emeritus of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Michael's a very dear friend of mine and chief of the WikiLeaks legal team in the United States. And to some degree, this book could not be written without him, in the sense that he's provided me with legal cover, which has given me enough time to be able, and security, well, it's a difficult situation here, enough security to be able to write the book. He's a bear with a very sore head at the moment. So, Michael, we wish you were here. And I'm sure that is also felt by a number of other people that I know are in the audience.
And Julian, just so you know, I just want to share with people here, if you don't know, Michael Ratner is one of the greatest freedom fighters in the modern history of this country. Litigated the first challenges to the Guantanamo prison, not just post 9/11, but actually when thousands and thousands of Haitians were taken to Guantanamo in the 1990s and were being systematically stigmatized as dangerous to America because of the potential for HIV/AIDS. And Michael has been just an incredible fighter for freedom around the world. And he is at present in a battle for his life. I saw him the other day, and his spirits are very high. He definitely wanted to be here tonight, and I think it'll mean the world to him to know that people thought of him here and brought his name into this room. So keep him in your thoughts and your hearts, because Michael Ratner is important to so many causes around the world. Julian, are you able to hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Okay, so basically what I was asking you before is how you have managed to stay relevant despite the fact that you are stuck in a few rooms. You still get documents. You had the bounty on the TPP that produced results. You managed to shift that debate and impact that debate. And it seems like when people are trying to say, oh, well, WikiLeaks was just the Manning stuff or just Iraq and Afghanistan, you somehow always manage to pop up with new documents. And I'm just wondering, I don't want you to divulge any sources or methods, but how is it that you're able to do that given that you are where you are right now?
Well, I can divulge the sources and methods quite easily. Sheer bloody mindedness on the one hand, and on the other hand, having a pretty good team around me of people in my organization. So that's, I mean, we can go further afield, and of course we have legal support, and we have a bunch of donors in the community, and sources still believe in us. It is interesting to try and pull it off. It is quite hard work. I should say, right around this embassy right now, there's about 7 uniformed police and about the same number of covert police in the covert action surveillance team that it operates around this building. Interestingly, it's done a deal with Harrods, which is a very famous department store here, which is owned by the Qatar Sovereign Fund that owns most of the surrounding buildings that surround the embassy. It's done a deal to emplace their surveillance teams in those buildings that Harrods own 24 hours a day. We managed to get hold of those documents. The budget spend just by the police surveillance alone, not including GCHQ, not including MI6, runs to $20 million so far, surveilling me in the embassy. It operates at about $15,000 a day. It's the one area where we've been able to gain political traction here in the UK, that so much money is being spent harassing someone who hasn't even been charged.
I remember how ridiculous it was when I came in to see you. There's police on the steps there, and they just barely give your visitors enough space to get by them. It's almost like they want someone to bump their shoulder. But then there's this cartoonish surveillance van that is right outside of one of the windows. I mean, is that an actual real thing, or is that just sort of like a prop to like kind of mess with you?
Well, it's
a huge
an
van with a big
question,
dish
actually.
What's that?
There's different parts of the surveillance. There's some that's not visible to people who are going past. Maybe actually about 2/3 is not visible to the public. But then there's a very public component where large, conspicuous surveillance vans are parked in front of the embassy. And there's a uniformed police presence as well. That's something that is done for public relations purpose. When there's negative press on how much it's costing, for example, that retreats, and they park in the side alleys, and then once that wears off, they're back again. But it's the very visible component is designed to be visible.
Right. I mean, it seems like it's meant to send a message. There have been some reports in the media recently about your position vis-a-vis the Ecuadorian government, and I'm wondering if you still are confident in your relationship with President Correa and the Foreign Minister of Ecuador. I don't know the veracity of some of the reports, but there were purportedly the purported documents.
Not high veracity.
Okay, so that's why I mean, I don't know if people saw this, but I wanted to ask you about it because it got a lot of traffic, and I think you should have the opportunity to address this. The short of it was that there were a number of news reports that basically portrayed a scene where the internal staff of the embassy was in conflict with you, and that you were there because of the grace of President Correa, and that a lot of others don't want you to be in that embassy. Can you address some of these reports and that are based purportedly on leaked government documents of Ecuador?
Sure, it's not simply a matter of political will. Obviously, a government needs political will to enforce its laws. It is a matter of law. Ecuador is a party to the 1951 Convention on Refugees and the Caracas Convention, amongst other conventions. And it has activated those conventions in this process when I won my asylum case with Ecuador. And as such, it has a international legally binding obligation to make good on the asylum. And that's a matter of, it's a matter of law, but it's also a matter of national concern. You know, Ecuador would be seen to be remiss in terms of its asylum obligations if it broke that halfway through. Now, does that mean that there are factions in Ecuador outside the government and some inside the government who have a different position. Yes, it does. And so we do have to keep an eye on what the domestic politics are. Not so much in terms of would it mean that they would violate their convention obligations, but more in terms of, for example, how much support there is in the embassy giving me, for example, access to this high-speed line, which we're doing this talk for at the moment.
Right, and I want to get for a moment, in a moment, to what happened to President Evo Morales' airplane when the U.S. government was hunting Edward Snowden. But one brief follow-up on this. Would you accept the post of Ecuador's ambassador to the United Nations if offered by President Correa?
Well, it's an interesting question. If I said I would accept it now, maybe I wouldn't. Maybe it wouldn't be offered. So that's
okay. All right. Fair enough.
A very interesting situation where in science we can comment about the weather, for example, and the weather doesn't change. But in politics and human society, you can comment on some feature of it, and then it changes because of your comments.
Okay, fair enough, Mr. Potential Ambassador. WikiLeaks recently put out a statement trying to clarify some of the events that occurred when Edward Snowden was in transition, moving from Hong Kong, ultimately ending up in Moscow. And of course, we know from your own account, also from Laura Poitras's film Citizen 4, that you very much were involved with strategizing around that and helping to facilitate Edward Snowden actually being able to get on a plane with some form of documentation. I have two questions about it, but the first I want to ask you, so we don't muddy the waters here, is we all, I think, remember when the reports emerged that Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, who has been a very fierce critic of the United States throughout his time in office and before, his airplane, while it was traveling through European airspace, was forced to land on direct orders from the United States. Can you explain, given that you were directly involved at the time with that reality on the ground with Edward Snowden, what your understanding is of what happened with Evo Morales' plane and the United States government? The reasoning was that they thought that Edward Snowden may be on the plane. That was why it was reported. Sure.
Look, we saw Edward Snowden was in a difficult position in Hong Kong. And how were we able to see that? How was I able to see it? Well, because I've been detained without charge for 5 years, and I've also seen Chelsea Manning and Jeremy Hammond go through their cases in the United States and watched and observed them closely. I've come to know far too much about the Espionage Act and also how the 1951 Refugee Convention works, and so on. So I read the Hong Kong Extradition Act and the Hong Kong Bail Act and contacted some very good sources that we had developed in Hong Kong and also in China in relation to the will of the Chinese Politburo. China has control of a foreign affairs function of Hong Kong. Domestically, it doesn't have a formal control of Hong Kong, but in terms of its foreign affairs function, it does have, if you like, a veto power. Hong Kong's relationship to China is very much like, say, Bermuda's relationship to the United Kingdom is. So the Chinese Politburo did not have the will to intervene on the Edward Snowden case and step in to protect him. The Hong Kong government, our sources informed us, were going to conduct things very strictly by the book. They weren't going to give Edward Snowden any breaks, but neither were they going to act corruptly in relation to the United States. What strictly by the book means for Hong Kong, in terms of extradition requests from the United States, is that the person who is going through the extradition process is imprisoned during the whole process. So that's point number one. Point number two, in relation to asylum applications within Hong Kong, Hong Kong has a very poor record in relation to the percentage of people who apply for asylum that it grants asylum, about 1%. Furthermore, in the past few years that we studied, it had never done it for someone from the West. Therefore, we thought that Edward Snowden should leave and go somewhere that he was more likely to receive asylum. And we engaged in a variety of negotiations with our diplomatic contacts that we had developed from my situation, and also in relation to us, if you like, specializing on diplomacy for a while. And I managed to secure him asylum offers and formal offers from Venezuela, from Ecuador, from Nicaragua, and publicly Bolivia was making some good noises as well. Now then there was, we routed him in a safe path to Latin America. A safe path obviously doesn't go through Hawaii, so you've got to go over the top. And going over the top means going through Russia. We also secured in Russia that Russia would not extradite him to the United States before we had even put him on that plane, to make sure that he had a secure route the whole way. And we put him on a Russian carrier, Aeroflot, in case there was any kind of interference with the pilot. Now, once he was in Russia, waiting for his transit flight to Cuba, the US government canceled his passport. That's one of the great own goals, diplomatic own goals of the State Department this century, was to cancel Snowden's passport while he was in Russia. I guess some more conspiratorially minded might suggest that it was intentional in relation to the PR damage that it might inflict on Edward Snowden to be in Russia. But I think it was most likely that they had started a bureaucratic process of cancelling his passport because they wanted to entrap him in Hong Kong, and they just got their timing wrong and ended up cancelling it while he was in Moscow. Okay, so he was in Moscow, and then we looked for, well, how can we get him out of Moscow without a without a passport? Because the airplanes won't take him. Commercial airliners won't take him. And we noticed that there was an oil conference in Moscow, and President Maduro was going to be there amongst other presidents. And one of those other presidents was President Evo Morales. Now, we then reached out our feelers to Maduro, who had already given an informal and maybe even by that stage public offer of asylum to Snowden. But we decided that because there was so much surveillance, that in this communication, our code word for Maduro would be Morales, because we were so surveilled. And we had lawyers involved and non-technical people who couldn't really communicate themselves. And then Evo made a joke where he was in Russia at this oil conference. President Evo Morales joked that at the end of the interview that, well, he was off to meet Snowden now. It was just a joke. Anyway, these things seem to have combined, the interceptions of us and this joke by Morales, and the US intelligence services put 2 and 2 together and made 22, and decided that they then had to expend vast amounts of political capital ringing up the countries of Western Europe and trying to close their airspace to a presidential jet flight from Evo Morales, which they did, and Spain, France, and Portugal closed their airspace incredibly to a presidential jet flight because US intelligence had asked them to, and done so without any legal or administrative process. And then the Morales flight took off and tried to go into its overflight path to refuel in the Canary Islands to go off to Bolivia. They couldn't do so because the airspace had been closed and was forced to land in Vienna. And then there was a 12 hour process where President Morales was stuck in the airport waiting lounge of Vienna because he couldn't get a clearance anywhere else. Now, a presidential jet is protected under the Vienna Convention. That's the convention that in fact protects me in this embassy. It surrounds diplomatic territory, and presidential jets are listed as diplomatic territory. So you had a violation, enormous violation of the Vienna Convention in Vienna. Now, this really sealed Edward Snowden's successful asylum application when eventually it became clear it was too dangerous to take any other option in Russia. Because what could be the Russian response to this downing of President Evo Morales' flight? The only response that they could give to seem like a credible country is that if Snowden asked for asylum, then they would accept the asylum request, and that's what ended up happening. So this incredible diplomatic own goal led to this bullying of Western Europe, which provided the ultimate proof that Edward Snowden was being politically persecuted, which is what ended up giving him asylum.
I love the Vienna Convention being violated in Vienna. You should use that one more, Julian. I'm a glutton for punishment, so I read a lot of right-wing former Intel people on Twitter, and I wanted to, because I think it's important to have you address this head on. I want to paint for you a picture of sort of what these people say about you and your relationship to Edward Snowden, and just have you address it once and for all, so that there is a response, because they seem to think that they have stumbled upon some dark secret by stringing together innocuous parts of sentences you and Snowden have both said to create a very fantastical conspiracy theory. And it goes something like this. You are basically an asset of Russia's FSB and the Russian intelligence services. And that through your connections to the Russian FSB and other intelligence services, you were able to facilitate a situation for Edward Snowden where he would be given safe passage by Putin and the FSB and the KGB, where he would then become an FSB asset, as you already are, once he was safely in an FSB safe house somewhere in Moscow, and that Snowden has just been giving the Russians all of America's deepest secrets that he accessed while he was at the CIA, the NSA, etc. What is your response to all of this? Beyond probably a funny joke that you're going to make, I would actually like to hear a serious response to that.
I'm not sure it deserves a serious response, but you're talking about a conspiracy theory that's pushed by the NSA dick pic guy, right? This is
Schindler's dick, yes.
This is a guy, John Schindler. He'll be orgasmic that his name has been mentioned.
I can't believe you've given him the satisfaction.
Yeah, he'll be absolutely orgasmic. But who brags about having worked for the NSA for 10 years and is now a professor, or was until very recently a professor at a naval warfare college in the US. And he runs something called 20 Committee, which is actually just his blog, and he posits these conspiracy theories. What is interesting about them, I should explain the joke. I won't explain the joke directly because it's a bit tawdry, but the reason that he's called the dick pic guy, you can just search for 20 Committee and Gorka, or John Schindler and Gorka.
I don't recommend doing this if you want to keep your dinner down.
Yeah. You need to have an unseen button on your eyes. Okay. So anyway, he's been pushing that. That's not actually very interesting at all. What is interesting is, because there's plenty of trolls on Twitter, what is interesting is the people who pick it up. Yes. And one of those just recently was one of the governors of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, the BBG. And the BBG is the US government's official propaganda funding organ. So it funds Voice of America, it funds Radio Free Asia, and so on, to the tune of about $1 billion per year. Anyway, this governor has been spreading that around the place. And it made me think, well, I know what the Broadcasting Board of Governors does, more or less, but maybe we should look in our cables to see if there's anything more on it. And I came across a fantastic cable from the Congo, from the US ambassador there, written in 2008, 2009, calling for a PSYOPs intervention in the Congo. That's one of the most interesting things that comes out of this constellation analysis of the cables, is the role of US embassies. Now, you think the role of US embassies is more or less to go to diplomatic cocktail parties, maybe occasionally to provide cover, diplomatic cover for some CIA agents, but to negotiate trade deals and so on. You think that's basically what they're about. That's not at all true. The State Department and US embassies play a unique role out of all the bureaucracies in the United States. Maybe only the Treasury can be equated in a similar way. The Treasury, of course, provides money for all the other government institutions in the United States. The State Department provides physical housing and lobbying for all the major elements of US national power. In fact, more than 27 different agencies are housed in US embassies, and the largest US corporations also get access to US embassy meeting rooms, and also special advisors that act as political advisors and trade negotiators for them. So for example, US embassies, nearly all of the larger ones, have National Security Agency monitoring equipment in them. Many of them have...
Hold that thought a second.
Military...
It's saying the connection is unstable. Sorry, Julian, you were just describing, the last thing we heard was how you were describing the NSA surveillance gear that is placed oftentimes on the top of embassies.
So US embassies are like a Rotary Club. Some might say an evil Rotary Club. And in that clubhouse is not simply the State Department. The clubhouse is run by the State Department, but it is the other major elements of US national power, including the Marines and Army and Air Force and CIA and Department of Homeland Security and so on. And the largest US corporations, although they rarely have a permanent station there, they are given access to meeting rooms and political advisors and assistants making deals. And the largest ones, in fact, the US Embassy sort of goes out of its way proactively to spruik them, especially arms contracts. So that's something very interesting that you get from a constellation analysis of the cables that we have published. More than 2.7 million cables now, more than 2 billion words. In fact, we've been publishing, even this year, 500,000 diplomatic cables. Okay, so go back to Congo. The US ambassador to the Congo put in a request for a PSYOPs intervention, which he had constructed the plan of in the Congo to beef up support for the government. And so that included CIA should come in and the Broadcasting Board of Governors should come in as part of this psychological operations intervention to boost up the fortunes of the government of the Congo against the opposition.
But how does that relate to the issue of the question I asked about FSB? I don't want to leave the door open on this because it's not just John Schindler. I mean, he is a risible person.
I don't work for the FSB. I'm not sure what more one can say about this. You can look at how they've put together their conspiracy theory. Their conspiracy theory is that because I said that I advised Edward Snowden to take the Russian offer of asylum because it was, in my opinion, he was much safer in Russia physically. And over a several-year period, I don't believe that I thought that the risks were too high in Latin America that he would be kidnapped or possibly even killed in the process of attempting to kidnap him. There's a variety of reasons for that: the weakness of Latin American intelligence services, the nature of their land borders, and that they have democratic governments that shift wildly in character between one election cycle and the next. But he was absolutely focused on the rhetorical counterattack to NSA mass surveillance and didn't want there to be any accusation that he was a Russian spy, which he thought would be used to rhetorically undermine his critique. So despite the risks, he was intent on going to Latin America. And so I said, okay, fine, we will try and arrange that. If that's what you want, my advice is that is a significant risk, but we'll try and do it anyway.
And I should say, just for the record, I mean, I think that those allegations are ludicrous. I mean, I personally have spoken with Snowden about this, and his views and what he's done in Russia are completely antithetical to the conclusions drawn by those people. But I'm so sick of seeing that line that I wanted to raise it here in a very public way.
A simple factual point, which I guess I should also mention, you know, the National Security Agency, they should give us a massive bonus. We made sure when Edward Snowden entered onto that plane that he was not carrying any laptops. We made sure of that because we knew he was passing through Russia. Mm-hmm. And we didn't want him to get stuck in Russia on his way somewhere else. We didn't want to create, if you like, any attractive bait that might compromise that situation.
Right. Don't let facts get in the way of those conspiracy theories, though. You keep making that mistake. We're going to get to audience questions in a moment, but I wanted to ask you about your introductory essay of this book, because I found it fascinating, and I found it to be a different style of presentation, and I thought it was it's actually a remarkable piece of writing, and maybe you can walk people through this sort of geography of empire that you describe as being told through not one or two documents or a selection of them, but as a body of documents, and sort of why you think this book is so important to understanding the impact of what Chelsea Manning did, or that we understand that she did from her own words in revealing these cables and other cables that you have published at WikiLeaks.
Well, I had a great frustration with the media reportage of the early cables that we published, the alleged Chelsea Manning cables. And we had dealt with over 110 different media organizations, had contractual relationships with over 110. So we're able to look at the different biases in different regions and even across different organizations, and sometimes even with different editors. And lots of cables were censored, either through selection or directly. The New York Times scandalously censored one of our 62-page cables about nuclear weapons in Iran down to one paragraph. Sorry, down to 26 words from 62 pages, which were the only 26 words which went along with the line of the thesis of the story that they were trying to push, which was that Iran could whack Europe soon enough with a nuclear weapon. The rest of the cable spoke in a different, almost completely different direction to that. Okay, so I was irritated with the reportage for that reason, and because of the shallowness of it, that, you know, there was a rush between journalists, and not to criticize them too much, but they're news journalists, so they do things quickly, they search for some famous names, and they find some scandalous comment or some hypocrisy, and they write a story. And sort of a habit was developed amongst cable journalists of doing that. Okay, so there needed to be something deeper. And I fully expected that that deeper approach, looking at the, the relationships between countries and how the State Department worked as an organism, and how the US worked in its modern form. Was it a modern empire? Not like the Roman Empire or like the British Empire, but was it a modern empire? And if so, what kind of modern empire was it? I expected that academics would do that, because we have produced the single most important repository of international relations, primary source repository, covering 40 years, 2 billion word corpus of information, easily searchable, well indexed, and so on. It's the natural thing to go for, the first thing to go for. In fact, many investigative journalists, even just many political journalists, it's one of the first things that they look for when they see a name that they haven't come across before in international politics. What do the cables say about them? But it didn't happen. English-speaking academia in the United States seemed extremely shy, suspiciously shy about how it was engaging with this incredible archive, this 30,000 volume archive of how the most significant international organ that the United States has actually operates in practice to administer the parts of the world where it has an influence, which is most. Okay, that was contrasted with other journals in other parts of the world, concentrating on international relations in the Asian languages, in the Spanish languages, in Slavic languages, and in German and French, where there is decent coverage, and in the courts. So the El Masri CIA kidnapping case, for example, 6 of those cables were cited in the judgment. El Masri is a completely innocent, even the CIA admits that, completely innocent German citizen, was snatched off the streets and detained and tortured and then dumped on a street in Albania. Anyway, eventually his case came for the European Court of Human Rights. Those cables were used as evidence. Chagos Island's case uses evidence. People have been freed from Pakistani prisons based on the cables. Relitigation of some of the CIA interventions in Spain as a result of the cables. There's about 30,000 citations of the cables in various papers, including, once you get out of the field of academic relations, journals inside the United States by US authors. For example, in epidemiology, the epidemiology of war, in in computational linguistics, which is how you look at language. And there's so many words in this 2 billion word corpus, it's a great thing for people interested in language to study. Lots and lots of these being done, even in the United States, even in US journals, even with US authors. So it clearly wasn't simply the legal risk. And US journalism organizations use cables about once a day. There is something published in the US press that is derived from that massive cable set. Okay, what is the largest organization in the United States that deals with international relations at an academic level? It is the International Studies Association. Now, the International Studies Association is viewed by the State Department, by the White House, as actually relatively left-leaning. But it controls 5 big academic relations journals, the number one of which is International Studies Quarterly. And there's one citation in the past 5 years to information derived from the cables in that journal. And the editor was asked about this just in December last year by an academic who was studying what the hell is going on with US academic journals not citing WikiLeaks cables. And the editor responded that the editors are in an untenable position because there's a rule which there are to be no citations. And that's because of supposedly because of legal fears. But that policy will not change until the ISA, this overarching organization in the United States, changes its policy. And I thought, okay, well, that's the answer. English-speaking academia is not going to study these properly because it is scared. Scared for legal risks, and as it turns out, much more scared, the participants, of not gaining security classifications or of not gaining contracts with the State Department or the US government if their name is on something like that. So we had to do it ourselves, and that's what we've done. Now, I hope that people will eclipse it. We have 17 authors, a lot of very skilled authors in this book, specialists in their field. But in particular, chapter 4 is a discussion of how we did it, and how to search the cables and how to understand this incredibly rich repository of state history, relatively recent state history. How to do that and write these sort of books and articles yourself.
And it's interesting to note, and I'll just say to people, there's a microphone here. Unfortunately, there's only one microphone, so if people are interested in asking Julian a question, you can line up here, and we do ask that it be a question because it's very late Julian's time, and we're on somewhat of a limited time frame here, but the microphone is here if people want to line up and prepare to ask questions. It's interesting to note, Julian, that the New York Times, which published a lot of material based on the bravery of a whistleblower, and sold a lot of papers and gained a lot of notoriety as a result of being one of your original publishing partners on multiple projects, in fact, had to be shamed into covering Chelsea Manning's trial, arguably one of the most important trials in modern American history, by Alexa O'Brien and other independent journalists who were doggedly there every day reporting on it. We joined a lawsuit along with you at WikiLeaks and other news organizations to challenge the secrecy of those proceedings, and to try to gain the right to just have a transcript of the proceedings. And what that ended in is the government saying, okay, you can have someone transcribe it, but you have to pay for it. There was a deafening silence on the back end of all of this when someone actually did have their livelihood, their freedom, their liberty put into the crosshairs of the most powerful state in the world. So maybe you can comment, and I know you've had battles with The Guardian publicly, with the New York Times about how they've treated you or how they've treated WikiLeaks. Maybe you could address that disconnect between the way they cover the consequences, your case, Chelsea's case, and the way they use the documents.
I've become philosophical about it. I was very pissed off at one stage. We had contracts, for example, and The Guardian broke those contracts. In fact, every single clause of those contracts.
Julian, you're breaking up a little bit. Let's wait for the.
Yeah,
hold on, Julian. We lost you there for a minute. The last thing you said that we could understand was that you had contracts with these entities, The Guardian, New York Times.
We had contracts, and The Guardian broke every single clause of those contracts. The Guardian editor has moved on now, who was responsible then. The awful editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller. Quite interesting to trace his history in our cables, actually. He's awful even 30 years back. He's moved on. And Margaret Sullivan, a very good public editor at the New York Times, also drew attention to the problems with the Times' coverage of the Chelsea Manning case. What you should understand is that large institutions like that have only interests. They don't have allies, just like states. And they're very careful at dealing with each other and dealing with states. They're armed to the teeth with giant libel cannons. So when they get into a fight, they have this ability to fire these libel cannons and be very damaging to the reputation of a state organization or individual. And so they circle around each other and act in quite a diplomatic way with each other when they're dealing with large institutions. Now, the New York Times, in relation to our collaboration, wet its pants once the heat started in response to the cable publications. Now, you could say maybe it's too close to the very interests that it should be policing. I will accept that as well. The New York Times, in various respects, has become too close to the organizations, the various aspects of the US government that is meant to be scrutinizing. But I think it was mostly fear. They saw this very intense reaction coming, and they decided that they didn't want it to have it hit them, and therefore someone needed to be the fall guy. And so all that incoming firepower, they didn't hold the journalistic line. They simply directed that incoming fire onto us, and in fact onto me personally, and actually wrote against us and tried to make life very difficult for me and for our publications by attacking us, and in that way distancing themselves and so saving their own skins. That was quite clear. They were horrified about being called a partner explicitly in the publication. They explicitly requested that they not be called that. Why is that? Well, because one man's partnership is the DOJ's, Department of Justice, conspiracy. The flow of collaboration and the flow of information back and forth looks very similar to a flow of conspiracy back and forth. And New York Times is petrified of that, but instead of having, I don't know, enough institutional strength to resist that, it felt that it had to create a fall guy for it. And so it pushed all that incoming firepower directly onto us. And to keep that distance, it decided to not cover the Chelsea Manning trial.
You broke up a little there. You're saying they decided not to cover the Chelsea Manning trial. We lost you there, Julian, for the last part of it. Maybe you can...
They decided to not only not cover the Chelsea Manning trial until they were beaten up about it, but the Chelsea Manning trial, you know, forget loyalties to an alleged source. The Chelsea Manning trial was the single most important journalism-related trial, free speech-related trial in the last 20 years, without a doubt. Also, it was the largest ever US military trial, the largest ever. Took the longest time, was largest in size, and that is at least since the Civil War. So that is a statement not by me, but by the prosecutor in that trial afterwards, in about June this year.
And it's a damning metaphor for the whole thing that you had the most powerful media institutions in the country, whether intentionally or unintentionally, colluding with the government to shroud the entire thing in utter secrecy. And only because of, and again, I keep reiterating this, a handful of independent journalists who were not working for money or for huge publications just refused to let silence win at the end. And it shows the power of independent voices, of independent journalism and independent journalists who often do work harder than their corporate counterparts and aren't swayed by the powerful.
That's absolutely correct. Alexa O'Brien in particular was very dogged throughout that whole process.
Right, and she deserves a lot of credit. Okay, Julian, we have some people here that are going to ask you questions, and I know your time is limited, so we'll try to move through it quickly, and maybe we can ask people asking questions to be succinct, and also if you can cut to the chase of the most important parts of your answer, then we can get through as many people as possible. So, all right, go ahead.
Hi, Julian. My name is Caroline. Thanks so much for speaking with us today. As all of this points out, even though the journalism was created as a way to check government, the US government is incredibly powerful. And so in an ideal world, what would you say should be the role of the US government within the international order? What should be the role of the State Department, and what should be the role of US embassies?
Well, a world with human beings in it will never be an ideal world. But let's look at whether things could be adjusted. I'm under no illusion that if Russia had the same expanse, more than 1,400 military bases in more than 120 countries, that would be a nicer empire. Or the Chinese. Chinese, given what's happened in their culture, probably less militarized, but maybe more conservative in other respects. The problem isn't the United States. The problem is simply that its empire has grown too big, and that means that there isn't effective bargaining power by other states in many different areas of the world. There's very, very few that can play off support by China and a little bit support by Russia. Very few states are able to do that. The result is that there's no accountability. It's my fundamental belief that institutions, organizations, even families and marriages are kept honest by the people and organizations involved having bargaining power. They can go somewhere else when they're fucked around. Now, the structure of the US empire is such that that can't happen in most places, and it's had a very corrosive effect within the United States because it has led to an extremely large military and intelligence sector, to a state within a state, which I'm sure Jeremy could tell you more about, more than 5.1 million active security clearances now, and probably about another 20 to 30 million people on their periphery. That has a distorting effect within the United States. And you can see that in a very simple way, a simple, easily imaginable way, when you look at Ferguson, when you look at the fruits of occupation and the methods of occupation in Afghanistan and Iraq being brought back home, literally in the form of Humvees and body armor, intelligence databases and fusion centers and so on. So my answer is smaller empires. You have to have a balance. I would say actually, within a country, the only thing that keeps it honest is, you've got a balance between the commercial sector, the government sector, the church, civil society, and the media. It means that people have places to go. That's what keeps a country honest. It is not electoral democracy. It is the ability to transfer allegiances and favors when you're fucked around.
The very last part before fucked around, we lost you on there, the first clause in that sentence. We know something was fucked around.
What keeps societies decent, regardless of their form, whether they're monarchies, whether they're dictatorships, whether it's authoritarian capitalism, or some form of electoral democracy, is the ability to transfer support and allegiance from one power group to another when you get fucked around. You've got options.
All right. Now we understand the exclamation point.
That's what keeps a society decent.
Okay, next question.
Hi there. I am a history teacher in New York, and this question comes from my 10th grade students. And it's very similar to the one you just answered, but a little more less idealistic and more realistic. They want to know what your ideal form of government is, and they say this because we looked at low voter turnout in democracies and the way voters vote, and they would like to know what you have to say about that.
Well, it could be a good thing. Why is there low voter turnout? Because voting doesn't make any difference, right? More or less. Doesn't make much difference compared to what you might otherwise do with the time that you spent voting. I mean, I was involved in an election in Australia, not my own, but supporting someone else's, and I manned a polling booth and I did these things, because that does make a difference, but actually the time that you spend voting doesn't make a difference. Very, very rarely. There's just just occasional.
We're breaking up a little bit there, Julian. You were just trying to dissuade all young people from voting.
Yeah, with very few exceptions, I wouldn't bother. I would spend the time. You don't become disengaged, but I would spend that time doing something else. Most people can do something that is more productive in relation to society than spending the time voting.
There's going to be an interesting debate in somebody's history class tomorrow. Go ahead.
Hi, Julian. You mentioned advising Edward Snowden against going to Latin America from Russia. More specific or generally, when countries offer asylum, what are your criteria for choosing which country gets the refugee? In other words, which countries are your best friends?
Well, it just depends on the person and what their conflict is. I founded a foundation together with Gavin McFadgen, a journalism professor here, called the Courage Foundation. It runs Edward Snowden's defense fund, but it runs a number of people's defense funds. And we were involved in getting someone else out of an asylum in an embassy in Baku. His wife actually works for the US military. He's a pro-US guy in relation to Azerbaijan and the tussle there in relation between influenced by Israel, the United States, and Russia. So that he ended up being transported on the Swiss foreign minister's jet. It ended up happening something like what we had hoped would happen with Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela and Edward Snowden.
You said something. Sorry, Julian. Technical problems, Julian. We missed it. I think you were just saying something about that case versus the Snowden case and your hopes. Sorry.
Okay, there are other people trapped in embassies around the world. There's some Ethiopians, senior political people who have been trapped for more than 20 years in the Italian embassy in Ethiopia. Emin Husseinov, who's an Azerbaijani media activist, more or less on the pro-US side. His wife is a serviceman. He was trapped until very recently in the Swiss embassy in Azerbaijan. And we arranged his lawyers, and eventually he came out on a flight during the opening ceremony of the European Games. He came out on a flight on the Swiss foreign minister's jet into Switzerland, and the Swiss government have stood up for him. So it just depends on the political situation as to who is willing to stand up for someone's asylum in a legal and political sense, how much that country is invested in the 1951 Convention on Refugees or other asylum instruments, and what the physical threats are to the person, and can they be physically protected in that country. So that basically the answer is, once you've applied all those constraints, there's usually very few countries left. You try and, it's not a situation usually where you can pick from 5 different countries. That's very, very rare.
Thanks for that question. Go ahead, next.
Hi, Julian. My question is, you've acknowledged a lot of the victories that have come from a lot of the documents that you've gotten. You're exposing, different corruption and different kinds of activity. But have you ever been contacted or have acknowledged some of the negative repercussions that have come from the exposure in terms of people who have died, whether they be military assets or intelligence assets, and how you acknowledge that in the grand scheme of considering what you're doing a positive versus whereas some people see this as a very big life-threatening negative.
I'm glad you brought up that question because it's complete bullshit. It has been admitted under oath by the US government in the Chelsea Manning trial that they could not find a single person who would come to physical harm as a result of any of our alleged Chelsea Manning related publications. And it hasn't been alleged, as far as I'm aware, in relation to any of our other publications either. Now, it's a very old rhetorical technique by governments to try and divert attention away from a scandalous news story. Now, if it's a scandalous news story that involves, as it did in this case, proof of the US government's involvement in the death.
We're losing you again there.
And maiming of more than 200,000 people in our side, we produced evidence showing on a person-by-person basis the US government's involvement in the deaths or maiming in Iraq and Afghanistan of 200,000 people. 200,000 death or maiming records. Now, what that publication shows is the Pentagon and ultimately the US political class that backed the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, covered in blood, and in some instances involved in war crimes and involved in torture. The response to that is simply to make a diversion along similar lines. Well, but what about the risk? Could someone get hurt? We just documented 200,000 people getting hurt or killed. So it's to try and, people are very sensitive to hypocrisy. So you try and, if there's a critique in one area, then the spin is back in the same, in the same direction. But it's something that's been used rhetorically with great effect by governments for at least 50 years that I'm aware of. But I don't know of a single case, there may be one, but I don't know of a single case across not just our publications, but everyone's publications of information leading to direct reprisals. There's plenty of events where the BBC, for example, publishes a scandalous report and there's a riot and someone dies. That's happened many times, but not in relation to intelligence information or diplomatic records being released.
It's interesting, Julian. At The Intercept, we have procedures in place where we give the government a chance to respond to stories we're going to publish, particularly in the case when we're going to be publishing classified documents. And I've sort of started to advocate a position that we shouldn't even ask them because they never actually answer a question, and they always push for more time, and they always give you the identical tin can statement. So we're having an internal debate about that at our own media outlet right now. But in a recent conversation that we had with a representative of a spy organization, this person was essentially saying, if you publish this, you're going to have blood in your hands. Now, it was a ridiculous notion, because it was a very benign piece of information, but it's their default to say you're going to have blood in your hands. And I was so fed up with hearing this over and over and over that I finally said, your hands are already drenched in blood. And our editor kicked me under the table, and but it is remarkable. It's often printed without any substantiation that WikiLeaks caused people to die. And I think anyone who asks that question should be required to present an actual case, because the US government certainly hasn't done so. But I'm glad that the questioner asked it, because it often comes up. And with that, we'll take the next question.
Hello, Julian. Thank you and Jeremy both for your time, your voices, and your relentless courage. What can an average tech-savvy person do beyond buy the book, give you that valuable retweet I know you guys love? What can someone do to help encourage adversarial journalism like you do, and help encourage the next whistleblower to come forward? Like Tor Bridge, Relay, Exit Node, VPN cover traffic. What can we actually really do to encourage and support?
Well, it's very boring, but the number one is give money. That's take whatever your comparative advantage is.
The government is
make money
jumbling
and
your
then give it.
financial appeal here, Julian.
So that's for us.
The NSA is scrambling your financial appeal.
Fuck those guys. It's give money. If you have a comparative advantage that makes money, say you're a plastic surgeon, it's a very extreme case, then excellent advantage, and transfer those resources to others where their comparative advantage is doing that job because they do it the most efficiently. Okay, that's a technical and rather boring answer. Otherwise, yeah, defending the right of people to do this is also quite important. So speaking about it in a very frank and robust way, not spreading paranoia. This is simply an expectation in a reasonable society that this sort of work is done. Keeping your eyes and ears open in relation to sourcing opportunities for organizations like us and Jeremy's. If you hear something, say something, but say it to us. If you find something, get something, give it to us, and encourage others along the same direction.
I'm assuming you don't want people to report suspicious bags on the New York subway to WikiLeaks. On that front, though, I remember when when these companies were starting to shut off WikiLeaks access to donations, and then targeting activists who were involved with campaigns to oppose that, including PayPal, which of course Pierre Omidyar, who is the funder of The Intercept, is one of the founders of eBay and has never publicly commented on that. And I think he should comment on the PayPal 14. And I think he should comment on this kind of discussion that we're having now. And I'm going to directly ask him about it the next time I see him, because I think people do deserve to have an answer to that question from Pierre and other people who were executives at the time. But I recall that a lot of tech people ran to the defense of WikiLeaks in helping to mirror the site, helping to try to figure out ways to circumvent the sort of financial censorship of WikiLeaks. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for freelance tech-savvy people to use their own innovation when they see whistleblowers or whistleblowing sites under attack. And many times we've seen people on their own initiative step up and do something far more creative than we would have thought about, even though we have journalistic resources to do it. So I think obviously you should donate money to causes that you believe in if you have that money, but I do think there's a unique role that tech-savvy people can play in an era where some of our best freedom fighters are sitting at their computer all day long. And I would just encourage people to, as you say, keep your eyes open to ways to bolster, amplify, support the actions of organizations that are taking risks or dealing with sources that are taking risks. So next question.
Hi, Julian. My name's Cody Dolson. I'm a student at the New School. I was just wondering, with the beginning of the U.S. election for 2016 and with the public opinion on whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, how you see in the future the war against whistleblowers, like if you see it advancing or digressing, that sort of thing?
In the context of the election, very interesting question. We're watching it closely. The bookmakers across 11 different bookmakers, you can't, for most of them now, you can't even bet on Hillary Clinton anymore. Not because she's guaranteed to lose, but because the marginal costs are more than the payoff. What that means is the bookmakers think Hillary is pretty close to a dead cert to win. And that has firmed a lot over the last 12 months. But anything can happen in politics. Maybe Hillary will have a stroke, who knows. But Hillary is very likely to win. She's a much more hawkish figure than Barack Obama. But under Barack Obama, we've seen more people prosecuted under the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined. In fact, more than twice as many. I think it's up to 3 times as many now, Jeremy. So it's,
The reason we're having the technical problems is that we're hosting this on Hillary's private server.
There has been some news reportage that I'm going to be Hillary's worst nightmare. I mean, there's all this Hillary emails that are being released and all that's quite interesting. Actually, I'm somewhat sympathetic to Hillary, although we've had our disputes in the past over the email scandal, because it's a ridiculous overclassification. And it's not surprising to me that she has been swept up in absurd overclassification scandals. And Hillary can't say so herself, but of course the correct defense that she should be giving is, well, most of this classification stuff is bullshit. There might be a moment where the president was about to land somewhere and the details of what hotel he was staying in should be classified for a limited period to prevent assassinations. That's fine. But we're talking about emails that are now several years old. So it's very interesting to think, what could still be classified, genuinely classified in those emails? There's nothing. There's nothing that could be genuinely classified in those emails. I tell you what I believe is classified top secret in those emails. Disgraceful efforts by the United States to subvert Libya, to subvert Syria, to overthrow those governments, which has led to the rise of the Islamic State, involvement with Saudi and Qatar and Turkey in doing that, which would be diplomatically very embarrassing if it was released. It's very unlikely that there's anything in Hillary's emails that could be genuinely classified now. By genuinely classified, I mean, according to what's in the law about classifications, information which would threaten the genuine security of a significant fraction of the population of the United States.
I mean, I know that if there is a whistleblower out there that has access to those current cables, I'm sure Julian, WikiLeaks would be very happy to publish them, and we certainly would be at The Intercept. And I agree with you. I think that there are scandals that play out in public, and there are public secrets, and there's investigative journalism that can poke holes in little pieces of it. But we're not even scratching the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg in what is happening behind the scenes. And that's why this book is so important, not just because of what it reveals about how the government works, but also it shows the potential for what could happen if we actually had transparency that was encouraged rather than criminalized, that we would have a more round debate in our societies about what the moral stance of the country should be, about what national security actually means, about what is the definition of a terrorist, how do you get on a kill list, how do you get off a kill list short of being killed in a drone strike. We have multiple administrations, Democrat, Republican, constitutional lawyers, and barely literate imbeciles who all have embraced this idea that the executive branch is effectively a dictatorship within the United States when it comes to dictating who lives and dies around the world on any given day. We only have about 5 minutes left, and I'm sensitive to the fact that we have 4 people in line. So what I want to do is ask their cooperation and just quickly asking your question of Julian, one in a row, and then we'll give Julian a chance to wrap up here for a few moments. So if that's acceptable, everyone, just whip through it.
In line of what Jeremy was saying, what do you see the role of WikiLeaks in a functioning democracy? And in relation to that, do you see a manner in which the general populace can engage with WikiLeaks without the interlocutor of a journalist?
Okay, next question.
Thanks in advance for answering. Basically, I just wanted to ask, with WikiLeaks and with your writing, Edward Snowden and all these whistleblowers coming forward, and the culture of intimidation and suppression against everybody now, how that works in American history and what it reflects on society, because you had muckraking and you had people calling for standards. You had the Woodward and Bernstein whistleblow on Watergate, and that took Nixon out, and that was a demand for transparency. And now what you've seen is no outcry, nothing. What you've actually seen is the media almost cannibalize itself in attacking journalists who do whistleblow and who do try to instill transparency. So what does that? Yeah.
We got you. Okay. That was very fast.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy and Julian, for everything you've done. And I want to know, Julian, in all the cables you've read and published and what did you find the most surprising?
All right. And our last question before Julian answers.
Last question is just, my name is Ian, and also want to thank both of you. And Julian, it seems like you made your name challenging power in one way or another, and so I want to echo some of the questions about your ideal sense of power relations. I got the impression you were a big supporter of the revolution in Iceland that sort of kicked out the creditors or stopped the creditors from bankrupting Iceland. But Iceland is also a Scandinavian social welfare state where unions are very strong and there's a very strong egalitarian ethos and social democracy. Is that something you would support as a sort of bulwark against power in general in societies?
All right, there's a lot there, Julian, but I trust you can whip through it succinctly.
Okay, trying the last one first. Of course, you can't teleport Icelandic society. Iceland has a population of 320,000. You can't transport that to a country with a population 100 times the size. The United States, or is it 1,000 times the size? Well, you can't transport that to the United States. It has a scaling problem. But you can certainly grab some ideas. In relation to WikiLeaks and but if we're talking about taking actions against bankers, sure. And actually, a lot of our work has been on the financial industry. Some of our earliest, biggest cases, biggest attacks on us were from banks. In relation to WikiLeaks and its role with journalism more broadly, well, people, and we encourage it, can interact with us directly. In fact, the majority, here's something very interesting. The majority, not the majority, the largest segment of our readers comes from India. The largest type of readers we have is not people looking at news. It's not academics, although there are some. It's not journalists, although there are some every day. It is people searching for who their sister is proposed to marry. They want to check out the groom and see if he's corrupt or not. It's people who are wanting to see who they're going to be engaged in business. Or it's the many foreign service departments, diplomatic departments and government departments outside the United States that want to check out what people inside the United States have thought about one actor or another, or one ambassador or another. So we take a view that the stories that we release are bait. The stories we release are advertising for something that is much deeper and more important, which is a historical archive, a grand library of how states actually work. Okay.
The remaining question was about, in all of the cables that you've read, what surprised you?
The most important one. Okay. Well, generally I always answer this question. The most surprising thing is not a cable. That's precisely what this book is about. The most surprising thing is the grand sweep of it all. You know, the big structures, that's the surprising thing. How it all knits together. But if you want little vignettes, well, I'll give you two. One's in relation to my present circumstances right now. I'm in the United Kingdom. There's a Conservative government in power, re-elected just this year. And the principal figures in that Conservative government are William Hague, who's the foreign minister during the conflict I have here, David Cameron, who's the prime minister, and George Osborne, who is the treasurer. So here is a cable back from the American embassy in London, back to DC. William Hague, the foreign minister, has come in to the embassy. And here's the report. Hague said he, David Cameron, and George Osborne were children of Thatcher and staunch Atlanticists. Haig said, whoever enters 10 Downing Street, that's the British equivalent of the White House, as Prime Minister, soon learns of the essential nature of the relationship with America. He added, we want a pro-American regime. We need it. The world needs it. So the current government that I'm dealing with, which has deployed this 100 full-time equivalent surveillance task force around this embassy, are the most disgusting, the most vulgar, the most embarrassing US sucks imaginable. Now, there's a secondary question as to whether Haig was being genuine or not, or whether he was trying to manipulate the US ambassador. But either way is quite bad. Either it's genuine or it's a Machiavellian kind of panhandling that the principal leaders of the British government have done. The other cable, which I think is the richest of any one single cable, concerns, it just has so much in it. It is so rich. It concerns censorship, the Kurds, Turkey, violation of the separation of powers, and the false status of Scandinavian states as liberal democracies, and how the head of NATO got his job. It's all in one cable. Oh, and Barack Obama in on it as well. Okay, so there's the Kurds. They exist as an ethnic group of about 20, 30 million people in the border regions of Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. Big news at the moment because of what is happening in Syria and Iraq with the Islamic State. They have a TV station, or rather, they had a TV station called ROJ TV. It's the largest Kurdish language broadcaster. That TV station was destroyed as part of a plot. Who was in on that plot? Barack Obama, the Turks, and the head of NATO. The head of NATO, until just recently, Rasmussen. He was the former Prime Minister of Denmark, and he wanted this plum job as being the head of NATO. He's an awful reactionary transatlantic.
Okay, now Denmark has just hacked your connection.
So, of course, the Yanks were happy. The Prime Minister of Denmark wanted to become head of NATO. That's Rasmussen. You will have seen him in the past year trying to foster increasing tensions between the United States and Russia. Okay, Rasmussen, former Prime Minister of Denmark, he wanted to become head of NATO. The US and Obama also wanted him to be head of NATO. The Turks are perfectly happy with him being head of NATO, but the way NATO works is that each country has veto power. The Turks wanted to destroy the Kurdish language TV station ROJ, the largest Kurdish language broadcaster. What's Denmark got to do with it? Well, Denmark is where ROJ TV was headquartered. It beams up to Eurosat, beams down into the Kurdish regions. So Turkey had been going after these things in a variety of ways. They tried to allege it was connected to the PKK. They tried to allege that it displayed too much violence and therefore fostered terrorism. It took those cases domestically within Denmark and they all failed. It was found to be a perfectly normal TV channel with no connections to the PKK. But in the cable, the prosecutor, the equivalent of the Danish Attorney General, and a senior member of the Danish intelligence service, PET, the equivalent of the CIA of Denmark, go into the US embassy to have a chat about how they're going to fuck up ROJ TV, because the deal with Rasmussen and Obama and NATO needs it. And the US embassy and the Danes are going, well, the problem is that we haven't been able to find any of these connections to the PKK. So let's go after it on tax grounds. Let's go after it looking at the content. Let's see if we can come up with creative solutions. And that is precisely what happened. They went after it on content grounds. They said that this Kurdish language broadcaster was talking about things too much from the Kurdish perspective, that it wasn't balanced enough in its reporting about what was happening in the Kurdish-speaking regions of Turkey. And so the Danish courts whacked it as a result of this conspiracy that was developed. The case is now before the European Court of Human Rights. The star exhibits in that case, the Kurds have taken the Danes to court, are these two cables, one in particular. Anyway, it says that that Barack Obama has sealed this deal. He's all happy with that. The TV station was wiped out. Censorship, not merely of one TV station, but an entire people's, an entire language group. So that's how the modern world works, including what you think is the modern, pristine world of social democracies in Scandinavia. It's not there. It's just a more sophisticated illusion.
And all of that in just one cable gives you a sense of the wealth of information that is housed on WikiLeaks site. I want to thank Julian Assange. It's the middle of the night there for joining us. I think everyone here really was happy to see you.
Thanks.
And as Julian fades away like the Wizard of Oz on the screen, let's remember as we leave that Chelsea Manning is behind bars, Edward Snowden is in exile, Julian is in this embassy, and other whistleblowers have had their lives ruined, have been targeted, and are under tremendous pressure right now. All of you should have one of these books. Make sure you tell your friends about it, talk about it on social media, buy another copy and give it to someone. And most of all, be out there in public whenever the crosshairs are aimed at any whistleblowers or any journalists. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Verso Books. Thank you, Bell House. Thank you.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.